get it now? What is elation? Me.
Actually no, your entire team now is Elation. Up to 20 stacks in fact. My gold Sparkle even being power crept in Elation in other games now. Feels bad, man. Anyway, let's talk about Lighter, because if you thought he will power creep Koleda, oh boy, are you in for a surprise. Just kidding, you are right. Anyway, Lighter feels much more of a support for ice and fire teams who also happens to be a stunner, rather than being a stunner first and foremost. And that is not because he does not stun well, but more on that later. I somehow need to keep your attention, don't I? Let's cover his kit and how he plays, his best weapons, disk drives and disk drive sets, his main and substats, his team's combos and Mindscapes, and lastly, let's also talk about his pros and cons. Welcome, I'm Rivenous and this is your complete guide to Lighter. I want to keep his kit section very short because even though they wrote entire essays for his skills, that are a lot of words to just say press left click. Lighter features a 5-part basic attack string with his 4th and 5th hit dealing fire damage. However, if you hold any movement key pressed, for PC players that is WASD, he will never reach those. Instead, he will alternate between his usual basic attacks and his follow-up basic attacks, as they are called in-game. While this is better than his usual basic 1, 2, 3, it is also worse than his better combos, but more on those after the kit section. His EX special inflicts damage and daze in exchange for 40 energy, and you can press it again for half the cost to cast a follow-up attack. His EX special can also be directly followed up with his basic 4. Actually, props to Hoyu here, because this is the first time they actually mention all of the possible you can follow up this attack with your basic X. Like actually all of them, not only some. And given that, his dodge counter, assist follow-up and quick assist can all be followed up with his basic 5, and we will make use of that. His chains and his ults, even though as of now you kinda do not really want to use it. So instead let's talk about his core skill and his additional ability. You see this bar? That is his moral. He passively gains moral every second and additional moral every time any squad member spends energy. 0.26 in fact, and if a squad member spends 60 energy, he gains 15.6 moral for doing so. That includes his own EX special as well. And when reaching 80 moral, the next time he switches in, he will automatically launch a quick assist of himself, which allows us to follow up with his basic 5, and when we do that, Lighter enters the moral burst state, which empowers this basic 5. This allows us to punch the shit out of our enemies at the cost of moral. At this point, I want to mention that we always want to try to completely exhaust our moral, as it will boost the finishing strike at the end, which will massively increase this damage dealt. And also daze, but not by that much in comparison. We also want to make sure to only cast our basic 5 if we have 100 moral, as every 10 moral spent will grant us 2% combat impact, up to 20% in total. If we switch in and we do not have enough moral, we can use our EX special, as spending energy will grant us moral, as already mentioned earlier. Any enemies hit during the burst state will also lower all the targets hit, ice and fire resistance, and when the finishing move hits an enemy, their stun duration will be increased by 3 seconds as well. That honestly is a lot of text, so here's the TLDR. Wait until moral is full, switch in, spam left click until moral is empty, switch out. Technically, that's not completely correct, we kinda still want to stay in for like 6 seconds to make use of the buffs we have, but I mean you get the gist of it. Lastly, his additional ability, it requires any attack character or an agent of the same faction, and it is really good, so we want to make sure to always have this active. Actually, I would argue it is probably the single best ability in the game, as it power creeps Sparkle, and I love Sparkle. Jokes aside, his moral boosted 5th basic attack jab thingy will grant the entire team 75% fire and ice damage bonus for 30 seconds. Well, up to 75%, more on that later. Yes, to the entire team. The only catch is you will need to hit 270 impact. Which weapons can actually achieve that, we will talk about that a bit later. And so much for his kit. Basically, swap in if moral is full, press EX special when you need iframes or moral or have enough energy, then spam left click. Dodge if necessary. Profit. That also results in his combos being very straightforward and simple. If you do not have any moral, hold any movement min keys pressed and spam left click. That will do what you see on screen, but we can really just simplify it. However, if you have full moral, we instead want to use any way to get him onto the field while also skipping most of his basics. This includes his assist follow-up or his quick assist, which again the latter will happen automatically, then we follow up with his basic 5 until moral is empty. If we are already on field, we instead can either go dodge counter into basic 5 or EX special into basic 4 and 5. That covers his combos, and at this point I want to talk about two very important things. First of all, these videos take a long time to make, especially the sheets and playtesting behind them, so please subscribe if you haven't yet, it really helps out the channel. I also have a Koleda guide which you can check out if you lost your 50/50 to lighter. We also have a Discord with cool people and Red Panda emote, so come and join, link is in the description. Anyway, back to the video, and the second point, an important disclaimer. As of time of recording, his Mindscapes have typos and do not reflect what you actually get in game. That also means, going forward, I have based my sheets on my testing and not on raw numbers stated in game. I mean, that too, but not exclusively. If my testing deviated from what is stated in his descriptions, I went with what actually happened in game instead of text. That also means if the text is correct and the in-game thing is actually wrong, well, some of the next calculations might be wrong. If that is the case, I will make a follow-up video. That said, let's talk about his weapons, and this time I have good news. And not that good news. While his signature is really good and plays easily into his kit, we have other options, at least in terms of Daze. Chingy's signature comes very close, and Hellfire Gears is another good option as well. In terms of raw damage, Lycorn's signature, the Restraint, is very good, but more on the lower side in terms of Daze. His best free-to-play options are also both craftable. However, there are two more things we have to keep in mind, the first being team damage. Both his signature and Chingy's signature will grant damage increases to the entire team and are the best options you have. Secondly, and also maybe more importantly, his additional ability. Only his signature and Chingy's signature can reach the required 270 impact, which allow him to grant a full 75% fire and ice damage bonus. The other options all hover around, well, 50 to 65%. That is still good, don't get me wrong, but important to keep in mind. As a side note, Hellfire Gears can reach the 270 impact breakpoint as well, but it does require 2 EX specials for doing so. That is not 100% of the time achievable, which is why I went with 1 stack. Before we continue, I want to talk about Koleda and what I said in the beginning of the video.
Lighter feels much more of a support for ice and fire teams who also happens to be a stunner, rather than being a stunner first and foremost.
First up, while his stuns are slower than Koleda's, he does one thing really well. And that is buffing your team, especially ice and fire teams. Well, only ice and fire teams. Including his signature, we will grant 75% fire and ice damage bonus, a 3-second longer stun duration, 30% additional ice and fire crit damage bonus, and 15% ice and fire resistance shred. That is an insane amount of raw stats for your team and cannot be offset by stunning just slightly faster. So yeah, Koleda is power crept in that regard. Secondly, because he grants so much damage bonus and crit damage bonus, that also makes other stats, such as pen ratio and attack percent, much more valuable for your carries. That also applies to their weapons, where Brimstone can get massively ahead or another slot 5 choice becomes better now. An example here being Burnice, where both attack percent and pen ratio become now better choices than fire damage percent. And adding a 2-piece hormone instead of Inferno now will net us a 4% damage increase. Looking at his Daze and damage distribution as well as the aforementioned buffs granted, we want to first and foremost max out his core skill, then his basic attacks and EX special into dodge and assist, and lastly his chain. Let's finish his builds. A 4-piece Shockstar Disco is his best and honestly only choice, with either a 2-piece Woodpecker, 2-piece Freedom Blues or Chaos Jazz, 2-piece Hormone, or really anything for that matter. If you play him in an anomaly team, anomaly proficiency will be better than raw crit stats or attack percent. And that also applies to his main and substats with either crit rate, crit damage, anomaly proficiency or attack percent in slot 4, again take AP if played in an anomaly team, attack percent or pen ratio in slot 5 and impact in slot 6. And we really want that impact on slot 6, that is his only option. For his substats, either crit values or anomaly proficiency, then attack percent and lastly flat attack and flat pen. I know many of you usually skip his Mindscapes, but I would highly recommend you to not do it this time because of the previously mentioned typos. His Mindscapes are okay. Honestly, they are more on the worst side, at least in my opinion. His Mindscape 1 description is the first which deviates from what happens in game, at least according to my testing. While it states that it increases collapse's duration by 5 seconds, that is not actually the case. As a reminder, collapse is his stun duration increase. So here's a comparison side by side. As you can see, it increases the duration to 5 seconds, effectively increasing it by 2 seconds. Except for that, it also increases the red thread by 10% and his finishing blow does more damage. And all of that results in a still really good Mindscape, even with the typo, which is not reflected in the sheets because it will first and foremost massively increase your carry's damage and not his damage. I mean, his also a bit, but again, mostly your carry. For his Mindscape 2, you guessed it, it is the same typo yet again. By instead of 2, as you can see here. That's an additional 15%, not an additional 90%. And that makes this Mindscape honestly pretty mid. His M3 and M5 are okay because he is a stunner and stunners like Daze, and that is our only other options. His M4 does nothing for him but helps out his teammates with energy, and his Mindscape 6 gives him a lot more damage, but that's about it. And that is yet another reason why, at least to me, he feels more like a support to me. His Mindscapes do nothing to increase his Daze output, instead they continue to buff his buffs and his damage. Well, aside from his M3 and M5 I guess, but I mean everybody has those. So yeah, that's about the Mindscapes. In my opinion, M1 is a good stopping point if you decide to go for his Mindscapes. For his teams, we are looking at Ice and Fire. Honestly, as of right now, his teams are pretty restricted. The only real Ice DPS we have right now is Alan, unless you wanna play DPS Okaku. He has more Fire team options as of right now, but none of them are fantastic, unless you play Crit Burnice, in which case Lighter is pretty insane. Well, to be fair, Soldier 11 is also really good. And as a side note here, if you play Lucy with Lighter, going full crit on Lucy is the better option because of all the fire damage and crit fire damage he gets, at least if you have his signature. And lastly, his pros and cons. His weapon is good, but not necessary, especially if you have Chingyu's signature. However, his full buffs are not achievable with free-to-play weapons. His Mindscapes are full of typos, so honestly I'm not sure how they will turn out on the live servers, but again, based on what I saw in game, they are mid. If they stay like they currently are, a good stopping point again is his Mindscape 1. His playstyle is a mix between Koleda and Lycorn, except they removed all of the clunkiness from both of them. And lastly, he is also the first limited male. For his cons, his teams as of right now are pretty restricted, which makes his account value limited as of right now, again depending on the units you have and play, but also that might change in the future. That one is honestly pretty well dependent on your account. And that wraps up the video. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end. If you have already watched the entire video, please consider leaving a like and a comment and let me know if you are pulling for Lighter or not. Join the Discord and don't forget to subscribe, yada yada, and I wish you a great day. Peace.